Welcome to The Access. I'm your host, Hayvi Bouzo. In this episode, we'll be discussing the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's sanctions against the Iranian regime and the strategy in Syria. To talk about all of this, we are joined by Dr. Emanuele Ottolenghi, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defence of Democracies. Thank you so much for joining us today, Emanuele. I appreciate you coming to our studio.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start talking about the FDD. This is one of the think tanks that's been doing great work, especially recently with this administration, in drafting and writing and creating the sanctions that we've been seeing against the Iranian regime and, of course, Hezbollah. Tell me a little bit about the FDD.
FDD was established shortly after 9/11 in 2001. And the goal of FDD is to educate policymakers and the public about the ideology behind violent extremism and terrorism, and to come up with policy solutions and ideas on how to best combat that ideology and the regimes and the organizations that promote it. So at some point during our decade and a half of research and work, we figured out that economic warfare, sanctions, was a tool that was somewhere in between diplomacy and force. It wasn't force per se, but it had some effective coercive power. And it gave options to policymakers to ratchet up pressure against enemies and adversaries, neutralize nefarious activities without having to either sit down with nefarious regimes and make unsavory concessions or dispatch troops. So that's the reason why we have been such advocates of sanctions. And of course, the previous administration, not just this one, came to see the effectiveness of these measures and fully embraced the idea of sanctions, a smart sanctions regime, as part of their policy toolkit. Mm-hmm. We are a non-partisan think tank, so we speak to Democrats and Republicans and anyone who is willing to listen, and certainly that has been the case both in the previous administration and current one. Mm-hmm. We believe that the best way to convince the Iranian regime to change its behavior is to make them pay a heavy cost economically, to raise the price of their nefarious behavior. And that includes, of course, their support for terrorism, their missile and nuclear programs, their human rights, mass human rights violations through their proxies in Syria and other places in the world.
Mm-hmm. When you say that you worked also with the previous administration, it's kind of, I'm sure it's going to hit people as a shock because of the difference in the approach between the previous administration and the current administration against or towards the Iranian regime.
Well, we were certainly critical of the previous administration when it came to the Iran nuclear deal that they negotiated, but we were very supportive, and we also engaged with creative ideas with the previous administration in the run-up to the nuclear deal, when the Obama administration was actually using sanctions and coordinating with its allies in Europe mainly, to ratchet up.
Especially in the beginning, when they were pressuring Iran to go to the negotiating table.
Absolutely, and we, as I said, we will speak to anyone, Democrat or Republican, who is willing to engage with us and listen to our ideas.
Mm-hmm. In terms of the difference, if we can speak about that, between those sanctions that pressured Iran enough to go to the negotiating table with the Obama administration, obviously without talking about the outcome of these negotiations and the fact that the deal probably gave a lot back to the Iranian regime. But are we going to be seeing, as of obviously, especially in November, similar or the level of intensity of the sanctions against the Iranian regime, or is it less, more? How would you compare the two?
There is no doubt that the sanction, let's take a step back. The sanctions that are being snapped back into action between now and November were mostly passed during the Obama administration. Some of them, the basis of the architecture was put into place by the Bush administration, W. Bush, but most of the legislation that is going to now snap back and the designations were done during the Obama administration. The problem was that at some point throughout those the development of that sanctions regime, sanctions were not enforced to the fullest, and all sorts of mechanisms and exceptions were created, or violations of sanctions were ignored, especially during the negotiations. So what you're going to see now is something that the Obama administration put together, perfected, but didn't always and fully apply, come back into place and be applied to the fullest, without exceptions, and very vigorously.
So they were never just implemented. They were written. They were never implemented.
Some of them were implemented. Some of them were suspended. And in some cases, like the case of Reza Zarrab, a Turkish Iranian national who was involved in a very significant money laundering scheme, the actions of the Justice Department to prosecute and to investigate and prosecute these cases were somehow slowed down, and the sanction evasion schemes that this gentleman and other groups were running somehow were not hit as hard as they could have. And so Iran always had some sort of a backdoor to mitigate the impact of sanctions.
Yes.
So now what we're going to see is a situation that is to some extent old, the sanctions before the negotiations, which were created and are very effective. And something of it will be new, in that this time the United States is mostly going alone. The Europeans, for their own reasons, and other countries in the world would like to still implement the nuclear agreement. So there will be a lot of incentive, especially within countries in the region, in the Middle East, who are not necessarily aligned with the United States, to facilitate Iran's sanction evasion. But if the United States vigorously enforces sanctions, vigorously investigates violations, and punishes them, then the effect will be even stronger.
And that's obviously including the November sanctions.
Absolutely. The November sanctions are crucial because they, among other things, and that's perhaps the most devastating tool of the sanctions kit against Iran's economy, they go to target Iran's oil exports. Now, during the Obama era, the Obama administration had created a mechanism for certain countries that depended on Iran oil to be exempted from US sanctions as long as they agreed to reduce their oil purchase from Iran significantly over time, and if they also agreed to create a mechanism whereby the payments were made in local currency, put into local accounts, and used by Iran only to buy non-sanctioned local products, food, medicines, you name it. Now, these 6 countries agreed to 20% reductions every 6 months, and that mechanism was put in place. These countries included China, Japan, India, South Korea, Turkey, and South Africa. So significant economies, significant buyers of Iranian oil, significant markets. And what happened is that in each and every one of these countries, Iran devised methods to evade the oil sanctions. Reza Zarrab in Turkey is, again, the great example
of that.
Perhaps the biggest money laundering scheme, although not the only one by any means. There were others in Korea, in South Korea. There were there was some schemes that were prosecuted recently as well.
And they were helping the Iranian
And
regime.
they were helping the Iranians. Of course, the Reza Zarrab scheme involved the money laundering of likely 20 billion, if not more, dollars of
So it's a lot of money.
oil revenue. It's a lot of money, and it's important to understand at a time when the Iranian economy was teetering towards the brink of collapse, where Iran's foreign currency reserves were dwindling, the fact that this scheme was able to repatriate over a fairly short period of time $20 billion, either in cash or in gold, was basically a lifeline for the regime. And the purpose of the Trump administration now in snapping back the sanctions is to ensure that if these mechanisms are put back into place, and I doubt the Iranians are going to take the sanctions without trying to push back, and so you can assume they will try to violate sanctions. If these violations take place and these schemes are rebuilt and put back into action, the ability of the Trump administration to go after them will be significantly enhanced by the willingness to use not just the legislation, but also policy pressure, diplomatic pressure, economic pressure, investigations, prosecutions, and so on.
I actually want to move to your work on South America and the involvement of Hezbollah and obviously Iran in attacks and crimes, especially related to drugs all around the world. I mean, this is a very major business that Hezbollah runs. Please tell me about your research, because you've done extensive research on this.
Absolutely. Hezbollah, as you know, is a full franchise of the Islamic Republic and its revolutionary ideals. It's maybe the most successful case of exporting their revolution to another country. Now, Hezbollah traditionally has been an organization, a movement, a force, a terrorist group that gets funding from Iran. But over the years, and especially since after the 2006 war, and even more so the beginning of the revolution in Syria and the deployment of Hezbollah forces on the Assad side in Syria, their budget has grown immensely. They have moved from $100 to $200 million a year to what's estimated to be at least $1 billion a year in their operating budget. After the 2006 war in Lebanon, they had to rebuild, for example, housing, infrastructure for much of South Lebanon. They have increasing costs to face for pensions and financial support for the families of their fallen fighters in Syria, and the numbers, of course, are growing. So they need more money. And Iran, especially in the decade from 2006 to 2016, when the Iran deal was reached, because of the sanctions pressure, was not always able to keep their financial support constant to face these growing needs. So Hezbollah decided to branch out and develop a whole business affair component of its activities overseas that would fundraise through illicit activities of all kinds. In Latin America, they have become increasingly involved in facilitating the criminal activities of drug cartels, initially by laundering their money. The cartel sells the drugs, it brings the money to Hezbollah facilitators. They use businesses that they may have in Latin America or in other places where there are Lebanese expatriate communities, such as West Africa, in Europe, in Asia, wherever they may be. Launder the money, return the money once it's laundered to their clients in Mexico, Colombia, or wherever else, and take a commission. That was, one of the earliest schemes that was detected, where Hezbollah was laundering money for cartels in Colombia and Mexico at the tune of approximately $200 million a month. They were laundering about $200 million a month for the cartels.
In Mexico?
They were in Mexico and Colombia through a scheme that went through West Africa back to Lebanon, using a bank in Lebanon, using used car businesses in the United States that were shipping cars to West Africa where they were being sold for the local market. Very complex scheme.
Very complicated.
Very complex scheme. This is not just a street money exchanger or somebody running a mom and pop shop. This is a very complex scheme where very intelligent, talented business people with masters in business administration who speak multiple languages, who have numerous passports, who have connections in the highest levels of power in the countries where they operate, run a very complex money laundering scheme. They take typically 15 to 20% commission. So $200 million a month is about 40 million of commission for them, which means that scheme alone could have generated as much as $480 million, $500 million a year in revenue. Now, of course, they have the running costs, they have to bribe officials, but it means that that scheme probably could return alone $200 to $250 million a year to Hezbollah. Now, that was one big scheme, but it was one.
That's one.
They work with a lot of criminal organizations. And what's happened in the last few years since that scheme was exposed is that not only...
Since when do you think they started this operation?
On this kind of scale, most likely around the time of the Lebanon War of 2006. There were, of course, cases before where operatives for Hezbollah had been dispatched to reside with Lebanese expatriate communities in Latin America, in West Africa, where they would extort the local business people to contribute to Hezbollah, to sort of give a percentage of their revenues, where they would generate revenue through criminal activities such as bringing counterfeited goods and selling them through their shops. But the scale of what they're doing now is something completely different. I mean, we're talking about multi-ton shipments of cocaine that they facilitate from Latin America into Europe, into
Europe,
and United States as well. And
from which countries specifically? Mostly.
The cocaine originates mainly from Colombia. The shipments can be coming from Colombia, but they could be coming also from Brazil. Brazil is an important transit country for cocaine. There are some shipments from Ecuador, but I think the bulk is Colombia and Brazil, where the cocaine flows out into Europe. They're also using their control over security at the international airport in Beirut to facilitate the entry of mules. So we're talking about smaller quantities, but more frequent trips of people who carry small quantities of cocaine, a few kilos in their suitcases, concealed in their clothes, or even
Lebanon.
within, mainly to Lebanon, yes, mainly to Lebanon, but some also to Syria. There's just a recent case of 3 Colombians that were arrested in Paraguay. The Colombians were running a lab that was disguising cocaine into commercial merchandise that could be shipped, and they were preparing a test shipment of 30 kilos of cocaine to an address in Latakia, Syria. So other places in the Middle East as well. And Lebanon is really a gateway. When the cocaine gets to Lebanon, it doesn't necessarily stay only in Lebanon. It can then go further to the Gulf, where it fetches an even higher price. The current cocaine price per kilo in Lebanon wholesale is around $70,000. When you move to the Gulf, it already bumps up to $100,000 to $120,000. So the margins of profit are very significant. That's why Hezbollah, from taking a commission, has moved to actually taking payment in merchandise. So instead of taking cash at the end of the scheme, they take cocaine at the beginning of the journey. And then they have already set up their networks to sell the cocaine to local distributors. You see, the cartels are very good at controlling their territory and at producing and making cocaine available for foreign markets. But they don't necessarily have the global reach to deliver the cocaine everywhere. And there are growing markets as far afield as Australia.
And that's where Hezbollah comes in.
And that's where Hezbollah comes in. And also, they're not necessarily capable of laundering the money all the way back home. So that's why Hezbollah is an ideal partner. They have a global presence, a global network. They have support and sympathy among Shia communities wherever these communities may be found. And this sympathy translates into profit for those who cooperate and revenue for Hezbollah in return, and the benefit for their clients.
Do they only deal with cocaine, or do they do heroin?
They deal mainly in cocaine in Latin America because that is the main drug that is being exported from there.
Yes.
But in the Middle East, they have been associated with the trade of synthetic drugs, such as amphetamines, of cigarettes. They of course trade an enormous amount of counterfeited goods, especially in Latin America. They launder money through commercial real estate projects. They have been linked to more sinister activities such as human trafficking in West Africa. potentially illegal timber, blood diamonds. Wherever there is a profit to be made, sooner or later you may find Shia Lebanese helping to launder the revenues from criminal.
No matter how sinister it is,
no matter how
they're willing
sinister.
to do it.
Yes.
So these mountain evidence that you've also uncovered with your research, how are you intending to have them be used? We know that there was a case in Argentina recently. Tell us more about this.
Well, so part of the reason that these activities continue is that these communities of facilitators are able to bribe their way to impunity with local authorities. So they need to operate in countries where the economy is developed enough that they can run these schemes, but where the politics are corrupt enough that they can buy off the silence and complicity of politicians, judges, prosecutors, border guards, custom officers at the airports and ports, etc., etc., etc. And that's what they do, really. So because of this situation where local governments tend to do little to stop these activities, FDD, among others, has been putting the spotlight on this problem, because we think that if you can't, if the arm of the US law and US sanctions cannot reach these places, certainly naming and shaming and sort of putting the spotlight on these activities, naming and shaming local authorities, the facilitators, those who are accomplices to this type of crime, help somehow move the dial. And we've discovered that it is working, actually, because local authorities, through, there was a mixture of ignorance, complicity, collusion, disbelief in the accusations, but, with years of research bringing facts and evidence, figures, data, we are seeing some change. It is also the case that when we started the research, some of the Latin American countries we're looking at had governments that were deeply unfriendly to the United States and also politically aligned or cooperating with Iran. So they were unwilling to recognize this problem. Argentina was one of them at the time. So was Brazil. But there have been changes at the helm in those countries. And so we're seeing a new willingness of their bureaucracies and their investigators, judges, and so on to actually tackle this issue.
Potentially, what do you hope to see happening, especially in Latin America, since it's the cocaine business and that's like probably the most, the biggest in terms of the capital money, of how much they can make.
And so we're hoping to see that local governments will recognize that it is actually not just doing a favor to the United States, which has a checkered history in Latin America. It's not always seen positively by local governments, but they should recognize that it is in their own national interest to go after these things, because the corruption is eating away public resources and undermining the rule of law and democracy in those societies. The rising power of the cartels and organized crime is bringing violence to their cities, is taking resources away from good honest business, is going to impair their ability to develop, to grow economically. So I think it's in their interest to stamp out this phenomenon and fight organized crime and those like Hezbollah who facilitate organized crime in its activities.
When we talk about, for example, right now in Iran, we see those sanctions, do you think the implications of these current sanctions are going to have a harder hit on the Iranian regime than when we saw before the JCPOA?
I think so, because the Iranian regime did not use the JCPOA to somehow restore its economy and improve the living conditions of its people. It did not use the JCPOA to invest in infrastructure, to develop those sectors of the economy that had suffered from sanctions and also from decades of war, isolation, and mismanagement. It didn't stamp out corruption. It didn't do any of the things that a normal country would do given such, beneficial economic package. The Iranian regime decided to take the economic benefits and the new openness produced by the JCPOA in order to continue its, its pursuit of adventure and dominance in the region, support for terror organizations such as Hezbollah and the like. And the result is that despite having had 2.5 years of sanctions relief during the time, between the time the JCPOA was passed, was approved,
and
the time,
cash handed to them.
And cash handed to them as well in large amounts. Despite that, their economy got worse. Some macroeconomic indicators may have improved, but the general living condition of ordinary Iranians has not improved. It has gotten worse. Their spending in support of the Assad regime and the military operations they're conducting in Syria has bludgeoned the state coffers. Their currency has collapsed because the economic conditions do not enhance investors' confidence regardless of the JCPOA. So on all these levels, their economy is worse today. Mm-hmm. And now are coming the sanctions that are going to squeeze the economy even more. And my hope is certainly to see that the protests you're seeing in Iran today, many of which are, the product of economic conditions. I mean, there are workers protesting because they have been unpaid for months. Mm-hmm. There are teachers protesting because they haven't been paid. It's not just, resentment.
Because of the religious factor.
Because of the religious factor. There is a lot of factors that, of course, are all the product of this Islamic Republic prioritizing their jihad in Syria, their support for Hezbollah, their support for the Houthis, and their support for exporting the revolution over the world, instead of investing in the future of their own people. But the hope is that these sanctions will create even more pressure, and the regime will be really with its back against the wall from popular pressure at home, economic data showing the economy crumbling, and international companies not wanting to go back into Iran because regardless of what their government do, they don't want to get in the crosshair of US sanctions.
Mm-hmm. So you expect that obviously all the European companies who were already in Iran are going to be pulling out one after another? I
don't expect everybody to pull out. Even at the height of the sanctions regime before the JCPOA, mm-hmm. Europe had still several billion euro worth of trade with mm-hmm. Iran every year. I don't mind if the Europeans sell shoes and design glasses mm-hmm. and, Villeroy & Boch bathrooms mm-hmm. And Italian design kitchens mm-hmm. or whatever you name it. We don't mind that. Mm-hmm. I don't think that the Trump administration minds that.
That's not going to affect.
It's not going to affect. What Iran needs is large infrastructure project. Mm-hmm. Iran has a water crisis that could leave a large portion of the country desertifying within years. Wow. They need large investments to fix all the damage they've done to their river system and so on. They need investment to improve the performance of their extractive capacity in the oil sector. They need to modernize their oil and energy sector. Their aviation sector needs to be upgraded dramatically, and they're not going to get that because of the decision by the Trump administration to shut down the JCPOA and therefore block the sale of new aircraft. So all of this is going to put them even more behind than they were already.
Yes.
And I think that it is going to be extremely effective regardless of the few billion euro worth of food and medicine and clothing and mm-hmm. other such products that will still be traded with Europe on a yearly basis.
What about obviously their military presence in other countries? If this is, if we are seeing now a continuation of the sanctions, of this continuous policy and strategy by this administration, we know that, for example, now the Assad regime has said after the visit of the Iranian defense minister that they're going to be basically building the Syrian army. We know that already they infiltrated the Syrian Arab, quote-unquote, army by all of their militias. But now we know that officially they're going to be supposedly building it up. We know that obviously Hezbollah question, because Hezbollah has its own financial resources. It doesn't really need the money from the Iranian regime as much anymore. And then there's the Houthis. So what are we going to be looking at in terms of the progress of the changing situation for these militias and these kind of stretched out Iranian influence?
So, I mean, I think we need to differentiate. On the Houthi side, I think the Iranians have gotten quite a big return from a relatively small investment. I think where they're
even though it's the Houthis.
Even though it's the Houthis, and even though it is, you know, it started as a civil war.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But you know, the fact that this war has been going on for several years now, you know, it doesn't
help the people.
Doesn't help the people, and it doesn't look very good for those who initiated it. Mm-hmm. So now in Syria, I think, is where they have more trouble. First of all, because you know, the Assad army is depleted, and it is the militias who have to take the bulk of the fighting alongside you know, Russian air support and so on. So the question is how you know, how much that will impact the main contributors of the manpower. Now, one of the main contributors of that manpower is the Afghan militias, the Fatemiyun brigades. One of the things that drew these young men to fight was the promise for themselves and for their families of being able to stay in Iran, get legalized, be able to work, be able to bring money home. With a crumbling economy, you're going to start seeing actually Afghans moving back to Afghanistan, because Iran is no longer that appealing. And so they may find it difficult over time to sustain the draft among the Afghan and potentially also among the Shia of Iraq. So they may find themselves short. And we have seen that as much as their rhetoric is inflammatory, they're not willing to deploy their own troops, except for, you know, elite officers from the IRGC to fight. Traditionally, that's been their strategy. You know, fight wars to the last Arab who's willing to commit to a Persian cause.
Yes.
And not fight themselves.
Yeah.
But that may change, and I doubt they'll find that decision to be very popular at home. So they may encounter
some
growing difficulties
in
over
Syria
time.
with sustaining the militias.
Especially if the conflict drags on. Yes.
What about Hezbollah and his role
well,
in
you know,
Syria?
Hezbollah, again, it's a mixed bag, because Hezbollah has lost a significant number of fighters over this past few years. Some of them, you know, veterans, hardened veterans from previous battles. But it also has had some gains from participating. One is the ability to turn itself from a kind of a passive defense territorial militia into a full-fledged army that is able to engage in combat in different circumstances, from urban combat to offensive warfare and so on. It has been able to gain access to more sophisticated weapon systems, and it has become the Iranian proxy to train militias in the region. So it has been able to kind of take a lead position in the creation, development, and establishment development of this sort of Shia version of the international brigades that you know, you may remember from the Spanish Civil War, right? All the communists converging onto Spain to fight for the Republican cause. Now you're seeing the same with the civil war in Syria, and this leadership role in training and integrating Shia militias from all over the region may come to their advantage in any future circumstance where they decided to initiate a new war with Israel. They're going to be a much tougher adversary than they ever were to Israel, and they were probably the toughest adversary to begin with. So if that were to happen, we would see big fireworks, the like of which we haven't seen probably since the conventional wars between Israel and the Arab states.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wanted to ask you about this,
yes.
because obviously Israel has been very clear that they're not going to accept the Iranian militias to stay in Syria.
Correct.
Now we know that the Iranians have almost reached the Golan Heights. I mean, they're on the borders.
Yes.
And the Assad army is no longer an Assad army or a Syrian army. It's filled with Iranian militias.
Correct.
Those are the actual fighters, and they are on the Israeli border at this point. What are you anticipating that we're going to be seeing that fireworks, that attack by Israel to basically stop and deter these militias from all over Syria? Because we haven't seen much lately, even though we do see every once in a while some strikes against the Iranian
Correct.
militia bases.
Correct. You're going to continue to see those strikes. The Israelis have made it very clear that they're not going to tolerate the transfer of game-changing weapon systems to Hezbollah. So whenever they have actionable intelligence that those weapon systems may be on their way, they will strike. And they will also strike at any military presence that poses a direct threat to Israeli security. So they did target UAV, unmanned aerial vehicle bases that the Iranians were not so much using to fight rebels, but to conduct intelligence gathering operations inside Israel. Now, do these incidents lead to war? It's doubtful. Certainly they haven't until now. The Assad regime, maybe for want of options, really hasn't been able to respond to any of these attacks over the years. But the last war between Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah in Lebanon started with a brazen action by Hezbollah, kidnapping of 3 Israeli soldiers.
But they wouldn't dare now to do this again. Do you think they will provoke Israel?
No, but what I'm saying is that we know, because the Secretary General of Hezbollah admitted it publicly, that was a miscalculation on their part. They were not, they didn't think that Israel would react with a full-scale war in response to that action. So what we learned from that episode is that wars break out from miscalculations, and all it takes is a small incident that can somehow cause a massive escalation that neither side was anticipating or intentionally seeking. And therefore, the fact that you now have a massive military buildup of Shia militias linked to Iran just north of the border with Israel, the fact that part of that area is inhabited by the Druze minority in Syria, which has close family relations with the Druze on the Golan Heights. The fact that some of the people in the Syrian Golan, in the absence of state presence over the past few years, actually did interact with the Israelis, seeking medical assistance for not just wounded soldiers and fighters, but also for people, children, women.
Regular things.
Medical treatments that could no longer be obtained in Syria. Israel now has an interest in that part of southern Syria, and it could be drawn into conflict more easily than in the past. The question is whether the Assad regime, who is now basically back in control of that area, is willing to restore the policy of quietness that it kind of
did preserve for the last 4
ever
years.
Since the 1973 war.
I wanted to go on the hedge funds that you guys in the FDD summit, I've heard one of the comments was that by Brian Cook, that Khamenei holds a hedge fund of $95 billion. I mean, when you hear that this is one person who's obviously the head of the Islamic revolution in Iran, holds but that much money, $95 billion, it's just, you wonder about the level of corruption in Iran. And that's going to be my question before last. If you can just tell me about like that unbelievable level, basically.
So that is the holdings of the office of the Supreme Leader. It's not his own personal wealth. It is the wealth of the Supreme Leader as an office of state and also as a religious authority that, as you know, in the Shia world draws financial resources from his followers. Some of it, of course, may come from that type of revenue, but a lot of it is also money that, or properties or assets that were seized from ordinary people in Iran, some of which was seized illegally through pressure and coercion. But the point that you make is the most important one. When you have $95 billion in the hands of the head of the state, which do not need to be necessarily managed transparently with accountability to the public or to parliament, then the room for corruption is
completely,
it's immense.
Yeah.
And it is what you have, and it's also the point of a smart sanctions regime. You need to devise measures that do not hit at random everybody in the country, because not everybody in the country is an accomplice to the regime. You need to devise sanctions that go and harm and hurt in the pocket of those who command the country, because these instruments are tools of power and leverage in the hands of the regime. The fact that the Supreme Leader controls such vast economic holdings give him and the regime an enormous amount of power over the country. If those assets could be taken away from the regime, sold, and managed in the interest of business and transparency and not in the interest of religious power, then that could help the country develop.
Exactly. And can excuse me, this information, could it help the people in Iran just learning about this level of corruption?
Well, the Iranians know that. The Iranians know, I mean, the information that made it possible to document and map out the assets controlled by the House of the Supreme Leader is mainly public. And this was something exposed by a Reuters investigative story a few years back, and the Reuters journalists who did the story were actually able to even interview some Iranians who had lost their property to the Supreme Leader's asset. The Treasury Department had sanctioned the Supreme Leader's foundation that controls all these assets prior to the JCPOA. Because it had found that among the assets held by the Supreme Leader, there was a string of companies abroad that were being used for all sorts of nefarious, illicit purposes. And what was clear, and the Treasury stated it publicly, is that this foundation was rife with corruption at a time when everybody in Iran had to, so to speak, tighten their belts because of the economic circumstances.
My last question, and quickly because we are over time, I wanted to ask you about the nuclear capability of Iran, because this is the most important question. Now we know that in a few months they can have a nuclear weapon. I mean, this is how advanced they are and the stage of developing it. And then obviously we have Israel, who's not going to accept that, and the United States. Some experts told me on this show that the only solution for this is military solution to counter the capability of Iran to have the nuclear weapon. How realistic is that?
The only solution to Iran's nuclear ambitions is for a regime to change its priorities, is for the regime to recognize, like the South African government did after apartheid, that its pursuit of a nuclear weapons capability has endangered the country and damaged its national interest. And that the best way to regain the role they aspire to in the region of a dominant power is to become a benign dominant power that will turn its nuclear power truly for only civilian peaceful purposes. And
do you think that's realistic, though?
Well, it is realistic if this regime changes its priorities.
With the same ideology, Islamic extremism, the whole nine yard, how would they change?
Those priorities are inextricably intertwined with the ideology of the regime. So change the priorities.
And they will survive.
Well, the regime would have to change its ideology to change its priorities. But I still think that that's the best option we have for the Iranian people to regain their freedom and to retake control of their destiny through a change in the country that is what they want and that will make Iran a friendly, benign power in the region.
Very optimistic, but I will take it. Thank you so much, Emanuele, for your time today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks. That was it for tonight's episode. Thank you for sticking with us. Good night.